Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It is a pleasure to be at TEM. Thank you to our beautiful service leaders and to our lovely laners of Torah and Haftarah. It is, as David alluded to, Rabbi Shira's reading of the Haftarah that gives us the name that is special for this Shabbat, Shabbat Chazon, the Shabbat of vision. And that comes from the very first words that she chanted, the vision of Yeshayahu, of Isaiah, which sort of culminates the three haftarot that talk about destruction that is coming. And Rabbi Shira Johnston Lane so beautifully in Eicha trope, in the trope of Lamentations that we'll hear tonight. And so when you hear that, immediately, the puzzle pieces come together. There is a hyperlink. You know what to expect on the Jewish calendar as the sun sets this evening and as we move into Tisha B'Av. What I wanted to focus on today is why it is that our Torah portion, Parshat Devarim, the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, is always the Torah portion that we read on Shabbat Chazon. It's always the Torah portion that precedes Tisha B'Av. What are the connections there that we can light up for ourselves? So the way that this was most beautifully and clearly explained to me was by, at the time, a German rabbinical student named Naomi. Rabbi James can correct my hideous mispronunciation of her last name, Goimbo. And she is a Masorti rabbinical student, now rabbi in Germany. And if anybody would like to see more of her teaching, I will share this and you can see her actual shiur on Devarim and Sinat and Ahavat Chinam. But additionally, her most popular work of writing was a reflection that she wrote after being present at Yom Kippur at the House Synagogue in a small village in Germany. This was one of the acts of terror that have happened in the not so recent past when an assailant with a gun opened fire in the synagogue. And her writing on this is particularly beautiful, and it illuminated for me a different level of when she is the teacher who's presenting about baseless hatred and its corollary, baseless love. So it was actually Rabbi James who chanted in Casablancan trope this particular line of Devarim, moving from the third person, and then this happened to the children of Israel, and then they did this, and then they did that, into Moses's first person address, this very, very long song that he sings for a person who is slow of speech, uncircumcised of lips. And as she was chanting it, we hear a particular word that immediately transports us to Tisha B'Av, and I have helpfully bolded it and highlighted it for all who are here today. It's the word Eicha, and there are a couple ways that we could translate Eicha. It's like a rhetorical complaint, and in some places it might be wherefore or how or exactly where. It occurs 18 times in the Chumash itself. It is a favorite word of our prophets. And so you see it lots of different places. And then, of course, in the scroll of Lamentations, in the scroll of Eicha itself, where it is the very first word. But I wanted to contrast it. Its presence the very first time in this last book of Torah to its presence the very first time in Torah, which might be familiar to some, that it's the story of the exile from the Garden of Eden. And when Adam and Eve are hiding, having eaten from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, they are magically unseeable to God, perhaps, or maybe only rhetorically unseeable to God. And God actually cries out, "Where are you?" So I wondered if for anybody, there is some connection that you might draw personally between the way that Moses is describing, both the blessing and the curse of being the leader of the people of Israel, The eternal your God has multiplied you until you are today as numerous as the stars in the sky, just as was promised to Abraham. May the eternal, the God of your ancestors, increase your numbers 1,000-fold and bless you as promised you. But how can I bear all by myself the trouble of you, the burden and the bickering? How can I bear, and yet where are you? I'd love to see hands raised virtually. If Sam would be my intrepid TA, see if anybody's physically waving a hand at me that I just don't see because I've got the ribbon of faces up instead of the full Zoom screen. What stands out? What is the same or connected about these two instances? Go ahead, Harry. Harry, you are, oh, nope, I hear you. Go ahead.
No, that was me telling him to unmute.
Oh, okay.
There we are.
There we are.
Okay, two questions that seem to both evoke one kind of answer from me, which is the Hineni.
Ooh.
They say, how can I bear unaided? Who are you? What is the problem? Please define yourself. And where are you? Where are you hiding? What are you doing? What's the motivation? Please define yourself. And the Torah is always so wonderful with that one little phrase, Hineni. It's, yeah. Are you here? Are you here? Will you say so? Will you act so? Will you be so? And that progression sort of indicates that in Hebrew, it's not the thing, it's always the verbal action. It's in an adverbial sensibility. Define yourself, be.
Marvelous. So the question, when you hear the word echa or ayeka, which is how it is in Genesis, a question mark comes, and Harry has beautifully provided the response that could be in either of these instances. You know, here I am present for you to find me. I am present to be in relationship rather than hiding and absent. And also here I am here to lead, at least for another book of Torah, at least until the end of my days, at least until the end of this very important message that I have to deliver before I leave you and have you in the hands of your next generation for leadership. That's just beautiful, Harry. Shayna, go right ahead.
So as Harry was talking, the Verizon commercial came to my mind. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Such the zeitgeist of our year, Shayna. That's exactly right. And yes, I love thinking of that phrase on the lips of these characters. To hear Moses at the very beginning of this address being like, "Can you hear me? Is the line open? Is there anybody on the other end of this conversation?" And for God to say, "Can you hear me? Are you still there?" Beautiful. Anybody else before we move on? Stacy. And then I see Lisa.
I'm a little confused by these two statements because when I'm reading, how can I bear unaided the trouble of even the burden and the bickering, I think of our synagogue, how our leadership is really, when you all speak, you speak with an assured, calming tone, which brings the level of whatever is going on to a more palatable understanding or a conversation. And the other part, when this is the eternal call out to Adam, where are you? And Papa, can you hear me? Papa, can you hear me? And I know that's off key. Sorry, folks. Sam, I know you'll get that for me. But I was thinking of a lot of times when I am in distress, and I'm more like saying, if God, are you actually there? And having to like tell myself, if I calm down, it'll come through me. So Papa, can you hear me?
Yeah, you absolutely nailed the Barbara reference there. I would add one more musical theater link of in 1776, when John Adams is singing, "Is anybody there? Does anybody care?" Yeah, that's a uniquely CBST drasha on this particular linkage. Thank you, Stacy. Bless you. All right, Asa, and then I'll reflect a little bit on what's going on in the chat. We will move forward.
Okay, well, so you have to think God is God, and God is asking these people where they are when God sees all things. So I'm assuming that means that God always gives you a choice, because that's what real love relationships are. You can't force. God knows he can't force you to do anything, because then it's pointless. You just ordered someone to do something, and it's like they didn't make that decision, so it wasn't like they were doing it themselves,
not wholeheartedly.
Right. And so I wrote here, you decide if you want to answer, and it proves God will never force us to do anything.
What a beautiful illustration of consent, that God is putting forth the question, opening up the opportunity. So, God doesn't expect you to be a divine mind reader. I'm asking you, are you there? But it's up to you to answer. It's like you and Margot were on the exact same wavelength. I love what Margot put in the chat here. If God can be omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, knows everything, but it's up to us to be responsible and accountable. Dorina, you have also defined the question of the age. Am I actually unmuted? Do you hear me? And so maybe a very prescient reading of Devarim for the Zoom age. And Peter, I think that you're absolutely right. When we move into Devarim, it's sort of a book that holds us in a doorway. It's a liminal space. We're on the border of promise, but we don't move into it. We spent an entire book sort of retelling the story from a different perspective. And, this is where everything gets real. And as you said, God has delivered on the promise. There are lots and lots of Israelites, but what do we do now? How do you actually manage and execute and take action when your promises have been fulfilled and you're ready for the next step? So that's the very first thing that we hear in this particular Torah portion that immediately makes us think of the observance that's coming to us. When we hear Eicha, for so many of us, we are immediately transported into that shadowy space illuminated by candlelight, the house of mourning ambiance that we create for Tisha B'Av. But additionally, we know that one of the most salient themes of Tisha B'Av is, in the same way that the word Eicha or Ayeka asks how or why, we too ask what could have possibly triggered this destruction. The whole scroll of Lamentations is such a heartbreaking wail on behalf of our people, for a culture and a civilization that really believed in divine cause and effect, that assigned meaning to the external forces that shaped their lives on behalf of God. And we too, even us contemporaries, us moderns, whenever something happens that feels out of our control, there is a primordial part of us that says, why? What did I do to deserve this? What could have I done to contribute to this happening to me? And so we too sort of yell out, Eicha, especially on Tisha B'Av. And we know that this is the very famous Talmud passage that talks about the why of the destruction of the Second Temple. It's not that people were literally doing anything wrong. They were engaged in Torah study, mitzvot, acts of kindness. They didn't perform sinful acts. That was perhaps the reason why the first temple was destroyed. But there was baseless hatred, sinat chinam, and the root here is for hate, shin or sin, in this case, nun aleph. This comes to teach you that the sin of sinat chinam is equivalent to the three most terrible, most severe averot, transgressions or sins that really like are just beyond the pale: idol worship, forbidden sexual relations, and bloodshed. But it's striking that in our Torah portion, we too see this theme of baseless hatred. And in particular, Moses is describing to Israel that, rather than seeing the promise and the possibility in this journey, immediately everybody said, it's because God hates us that we were brought to the land of Egypt, that we ended up in this particular place on the border of the promised land, in the territory of the Amorites, who are like giants and make all these terrifying sounds like zamzumim, and that this is a symbol of God's hate, not God's love, not God's deliverance of promise. And Rashi points out, as Rashi would, you shouldn't read this as a description of hate. Really, God loved you, but you hated God. And then there's this beautiful quotation from Sifrei Devarim, all of these midrashim that are compiled that Rashi illuminates for us about the book of Devarim. What is in your own mind about your friend, you imagine is in their mind about you. And so sometimes, as was beautifully pointed out, that Stacy said, if you don't know if anybody's on the other end of the line, if you don't know if somebody hears you and consents to enter into relationship or dialogue with you, as Asa pointed out, it's up to the projections of your own mind to fill in that other half a dialogue. And often you only reflect what you yourself are thinking. And in this case, perhaps it was the children of Israel who were projecting onto God this emotional landscape of hatred, when really it should have been read the other way. And so there is the place where we get this, Rabbi Kleinbaum loves to talk about ahavat chinam. We have heard it in several drashot. It's one of my favorite things to talk about as a rabbi too. And if we are citing our sources correctly, we have to give all of the credit for the way that we tend to interpret the inverse of sinat chinam, the idea that we could love baselessly, to Rav Kook. And sort of in context, Rav Kook, an ultra Orthodox rabbi, was known for radical acceptance and inclusivity of Jews who did not practice exactly as he did. Everybody's got their limitations. I don't want to pretend that this particular rabbi was without any bias whatsoever, but notably, especially for the age. And his quote, better I should err on the side of ahavat chinam than I should err on the side of sinat chinam. He gives us some actual practical application of how we might enact ahavat chinam, not merely an idea, but a spiritual practice for all of us. Can I get an English reader to put a voice to these words? Who's willing to read out loud? Thank you, Stacy. Go right ahead. So start with the bullet points. Love for people.
Thank you, Rabbi. Love for people does not start from the heart, but from the head. To truly love and understand people individually as well as a group requires a wisdom that is both insightful and multifaceted. This intellectual inquiry is an important discipline of Torah study.
And so what if you imagined that every person that you met was a text before you, an entire story with multiple layers to be excavated and discovered, rather than just the pshat, the superficial level of what you might project or what you might think initially? Keep going, Stacy.
Mm-hmm. Loving others does not mean indifference to baseness and moral decline. Our goal is to awaken knowledge and morality, integrity, and refinement.
Keep going.
Okay. If we take note of others' positive traits, we will come to love them with an inner affection. This is not a form of insincere flattery, nor does it mean effacing their faults and foibles, but by concentrating on their positive characteristics, and every person has a good side, then negative aspects become less significant. True.
And so I tried.
I added that one, sorry.
That's good. That's good. That's your own commentary. You're inserting yourself into the conversation of the text. And I tried to model this a little bit in a description of Rav Kook, to whom we can give the credit for these words, that look like we're not pretending that anybody is perfect. We are not pretending that anybody is ideal. We want to recognize that they are real, but the realness of someone's presence on earth inherently involves goodness. And what if our inner monologue, what if our inner projection was one of love rather than of hate? Not to be taken superficially and simply just ignoring the stuff that you don't like about another person. As Asa pointed out, that wouldn't be wholehearted. That would also carry with it untruth. But going into Tisha B'Av and going into our own sort of liminal moment in between as we're approaching a new year, there are lots of things that await us in this new year. A reminder to completely orient ourselves with the practical aspects of Ahavat Chinam. And that doesn't mean that we're all just like trying our best to be good-hearted, but there are intellectual exercises that we have to choose to take part of, just in the same way that we dive into the study of a Torah text, and just in the same way that we should approach every person to note what is good about them and what we love about them, and make sure we're keeping that at the forefront of our definition of them. The very last thing that I'd like to hear from the group is if you can think of any examples that have touched you, an example of Ahavat Chinam, when someone showed you, or when you were capable of experiencing baseless love, or what you're thinking about when it comes to Sinat Chinam, baseless hatred in our day that we could be trying to combat with Ahavat Chinam. Joel, I'm so glad to see you and to hear from you. Joel, you're still muted. I think you should be able to unmute yourself though. Nope, still muted, hang on. This is the whole point of my drasha. Are you muted? There we go.
Hi.
Hi.
This is just an example. I live the Lower East Side. There was a synagogue a few years ago, an Orthodox synagogue that invited a conservative shul from out of the neighborhood for a meal before Tisha B'Av. And they called it, very literally, they called it Ahavat Chinam meal, because it was before Tisha B'Av, and the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed because of Sinat Chinam. And I'll just say, in the context of everything, other things going on, it was just so revolutionary. It was so revolutionary. Just, you don't have to agree with someone. Rav Kook used to go to Shomer Tzir Kibbutzim, to Marxist Kibbutzim, and his Hasidic hat and his Hasidic robe, and he obviously didn't agree with them on everything, but he would visit them, and he would say explicitly they were part of God's plan. So it was that's just so beautiful, and especially nowadays with everything going on.
That's gorgeous. What a perfect example, Joel. And I think about, the oft quoted phrase, Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Lezeh. All of Israel, they're responsible for one another. They are inherently connected to one another. And to recognize that, it's not that all of Israel is identical to one another, but that there is a relationship there that transcends and that we honor. Thank you. Before I call on Ginny, I want to answer to Peter in the chat that like this particular Torah portion, there is a lot of sinat chinam going on in here. There are genocidal campaigns, there's a lot of bloodshed, and that is another of the themes that runs through the experience of Shabbat and into Tisha B'Av that's encoded. I totally validate that observation. Okay, Ginny, go right ahead, and then I see Ari. But Ginny, I can't hear you.
I just unmuted.
There we go.
Thank you. Hi, good morning. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
I just wanted to say something that was very personal for me, but I'm not naming names. I had to separate myself for a time from our shul because I was so distraught over having losing so much of my hearing. And one member just kept calling and calling and calling, and I just could not answer. But when I did, I was so moved by the love of my shul and this particular member that I just can't express the joy. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Ginny. And it's great to see you. All right, Ari, I think you will be our final word on these subjects.
Sure. I'm thinking of an example from art of someone responding to baseless hatred with this sort of baseless love. I've been reading Angels in America again this summer, sort of over and over and over. And in part 2, Lewis says Kaddish for Roy Cohn, which is just like one of the most like meaningful parts of that play to me. And I think it's such an example of not responding to baseless hatred with that hatred that you've been giving, or that you've been given.
That's gorgeous, Ari. I think that's a perfect and completely, especially for this group, resonant example. Tony Kushner came to CBST for Pride Shabbat just a couple of years ago. I'm going to close a couple open mics. There we go. No, people got it themselves. And it did talk about some of his deeply Jewish influences on everything that he does in his life and in the writing of Angels in America. But I think what's so salient about your comparison is that it's not necessarily that Lewis needs to give a hesped in honor, right? You know, it's not a complete like description of every good thing that this person did, but Lewis can say a blessing, and Lewis can say the perfect blessing for that moment from his own experience, from his own tradition, to thank God for the presence of this person in the world and the gifts that they bring, even though they are not the gifts that he experienced. So I wanted to thank everybody for being a part of this Shabbat Devarim. There are lots and lots of words that surround us all the time. And as we move into Tisha B'Av, I love Joel's idea. I think each of us should take part in a Suda, a meal that is in the name of Ahavat Chinam, whatever this looks like for you, whether it's gathering with other people that you love, whether it's a really mindful practice of eating something that you love that turns you into a more loving person before we enter a space of abstention from all of the things that give us pleasure, so that we can really focus on this feeling of loss and destruction. Or maybe it means sharing that with somebody else. If that means literally handing over something to eat to somebody who has none, or perhaps a tzedakah donation to a worthy cause like Mazon or Feeding America. Joel, you wrote the closer of my Devar Torah for me, and I really appreciate it. What is one particular way that we can enact Ahavat Chinam this Shabbat Devarim, or maybe in the sacred slice of space moving into Tisha B'Av? What is some of the work that we could do on this working fast of bringing more love into the world? Shabbat Shalom, everybody.